Hi, everyone. This week, I want to get into a period known as the segregation period. This runs from the Union of South Africa in 1910 until the election of 1948, when the National Party became the dominant entity in the South African government, and apartheid was put fully into place. The segregation period is one that is tremendously important for South African history because many of the laws and institutions that came to define apartheid were put into place in some form in this period. This is also the time when the rivalry between the British settlers and the Afrikaners worked itself out in that's really not the right terminology. Developed in numerous ways that would become important later on. And so in some ways it's a transitional period, but it's also a period when South Africa really accomplishes things that allows it to create apartheid and to function in increasingly independent ways, independent, that is, of the British Empire. Just some general characteristics of this period. The first and most obvious is the white consolidation of power. And I think that's a simple enough thing to wrap your mind around without needing to elaborate a great deal on it. Whites simply came to control every aspect of life, of politics, of the economy, of social formation, and so forth in South African society. Natives were increasingly marginalized, and their rights were not only not acknowledged, but even taken away from them. And we'll see how that plays out. We'll look at the various legislation and the other developments that lead to that consolidation of power. Now, that said, there is a great deal of wrangling between the British settlers and the Afrikaners, and the consolidation doesn't necessarily mean a unification of the whites at this period. That does come later. The other side of that coin really is the intense and systematic and institutionalized racism that defines every part of South African politics. The race question is the greatest one, given the demographic disparity between the white community, who dominated politics and the economy and society, and the majority population of Africans who were locked out of any of that, right? And so, and in particular, in talking about white consolidation and about racism, we need to mention that Afrikaners achieve a kind of solidarity in this period that the British are never able to muster. This is why the Afrikaners, even though they were economically in a disadvantaged position relative to the British, why they were able to gain control of the lion's share of power in terms of politics, right? They kept a united front in just about every case. That we will see places where this fractures, but it comes back together very quickly, specifically over the issue of the world wars, which I'll talk about in just a minute here. Another theme that we want to pay attention to is the plight of the native Africans, the blacks, right? And we could, I think, label their existence in this period with two terms here: survival and strategies, right? That the blacks really were just trying to weather the increasingly disadvantaged position that they were in due to the white consolidation of power and the racism coupled that led to discriminatory legislation, to a fully segregated society, and to a situation where they were locked out of any hope of economic advancement. And so survival really does define this in many ways, but the blacks did come up with strategies for trying to regain a position in South African politics. And some key figures and organizations emerge in this period. Not least would be the African National Congress, and its counterparts among the Greek or colored community, and the Asian or Indian, mostly Indian community in Natal. They both had their own political parties as well. This is the period, at least the beginning of this period, is when Gandhi was still in South Africa and still, fomenting for some kind of change, better situation for the Indian community. And so, these the emergence of political parties, as well as trade unions and other things, and these are harbingers of things to come. One document that I would draw your attention to that I think captures both the survival and the strategy is in the Williams book, Part 3, Section C, document number 2. And even though this is a little earlier than this period, I think that it's still one that can be read in conjunction with the themes we're talking about here, right? And I'm not going to kind of go through this systematically, but in this interview with this is a kind of roundtable discussion or something like that, a meeting recorded between some of the leaders of the Black community as part of a meeting of the South African Native Affairs Commission. Now, this was made up partly of white representatives from the government, and this is before Union, and so this is during a time when the British were ruling after the South African War. But they're interviewing people young Africans who seem to be educated and hold positions of some import in the mines. And, already we see a lot of concerns about the past laws, about the special taxes that are placed upon the Africans, about the lack of opportunity to obtain education, even though some of these do say they are educated. I assume that education would come from mission schools, which are really, at this point in time, the only ones operating among Africans. In the segregation period, that's going to change, as we'll see. Actually, in the early apartheid period, so we'll get there. One of the things that strikes me about this document is it's also quite revealing, I think, of the European community attitudes toward the blacks, because the interviewers ask some really strange questions in here, right? So they're talking about how in the homelands, in the reserves, as they were called at this point, where the black people were supposed to live, that they are facing a lot of crowding, and this is an overpopulated situation, right? And also in what we're emerging as what were called the locations, that there are a large number of blacks living in a very consolidated area, and the laws are in these locations, which became the townships of South Africa, that they had to observe curfew and things like this. And so these people being interviewed are worried about that, complaining about that. And then the interviewer says this, and this is what's really puzzling to me. Do you not see among those many thousands of people, there are a great many who are bad people? I do not mean they are all bad, but there are many who are bad. And those bad people who are going about would do things which would get the whole of the black population into trouble. Right? That, to me, just smacks of kind of white privilege and of the European lack of concern of the terribly unfair situation black communities in here. They're simply saying, well, you blacks have a lot of bad people among you, and they tend to crime, and so, don't you think it's better that we have curfew laws because they can get the whole black population in trouble if, there are bad people out there? And the respondent simply says, and this to me is sort of conditioning. These responses are often, well, yeah, I can, you're right. They don't want to argue too harshly against this because they know they're in a disadvantaged position. So the respondent says, it is so, but the law has got police and a jail in which to lock up those people. The law is there to see about those people who do not do right. Like, okay, so yes, that's true. There are bad people among us, but there is a law and there's jail and there's a police force, so they need to do their job, right? And there's a pattern that kind of follows through this whole document where the interviewer asks these rather um, aloof and even, we might say, naive questions, right? There's a lot of questions about the blacks being able to obtain alcohol, for instance, right? And it seems the whites are very concerned about that because this is going to lead to violence and those sorts of things. And blacks are like, well, shouldn't we have the same privileges other people do? And I mean, but they have to kind of recognize their audience, right? The interviewers. So take a look at that document and see what sense you can make of it. I think it's highly revealing of the distance between the white position and the black position, and also of this black strategy to try to argue for their greater participation in society and also kind of their survival strategies. One thing that we want to pay attention to as we look at this period are the effects of the world wars. Both the First and Second World War had a dramatic impact on South Africa and revealed the open tensions, especially between the British and Afrikaner communities. The Afrikaners culturally felt a much stronger tie to Germany, and even tried to argue that South Africa ought to remain neutral in those wars, or some of them argued they ought to side with Germany. And this, especially the Second World War, led to splits in political parties and to the reshaping of South African politics. The World Wars, especially the Second World War, did serve to bolster the South African economy a great deal, because South Africa did side with Britain in the Second World War, and they supplied a lot of materials to the war effort. The economy grew precipitously in that period, and South Africa emerged in a really good economic position right after the war, which is also when the National Party came firmly to power and put apartheid into place, and they rode the wave of a good economy to remain, partly at least, to remain in power and to continue to further the racial discrimination and the apartheid system. And so that the effect of the good economy of South Africa as a result of the Second World War cannot be ignored as a factor here. So I want to spend the rest of this lecture, and I hope this won't go too long, talking about the politics in the white community in South Africa in this period. And I'm only going to go up to the Second World War at this point because we'll need to pay some special attention to the Second World War and the fissures that opened in South African politics. There had long been, as we know, at this point, Afrikaner English contention, right? And even though there was a union in 1910 and there was a kind of compromise made as part of that union, the British came to support the policies of Louis Botha, P.W. Botha's later, Louis Botha and Jan Smuts. Smuts himself, had been educated at Cambridge University. He was very close to many of the British members of South African society. He was seen as somewhat pro-British, so he was a politician they could stomach, as it were, and there was for a time a kind of truce between them. However, the role of Britain in South African society, in South African politics, given that Britain was still technically a dependent of the British Crown, the Afrikaners often chafed under that system, and this is one of the things that leads to further political development. The Afrikaners were concerned about the preservation of their culture, and this is a theme we're going to see all through the 20th century, that whenever there seems to be a threat, the Afrikaners band together and talk about the necessity of preserving their language, preserving their unique culture, their heritage, Afrikaners very concerned about their history, especially high moments in their history like the Great Trek and their suffering during the South African War and all of that, right? And so, and the British were often the target of these things. The British were the catalyst for Afrikaner suffering, for instance, right? So Afrikaner culture really comes into its own after Union and produces a lot of that solidarity we were talking about. I talked about that already, that there's a lot of contention over the issue of the place of South Africa in the British Empire, Afrikaners wanting to break away and become more independent of Britain, the British citizens of South Africa obviously wanting to maintain very close ties, right? So these are the things that lead to tension. Botha and Smuts lead the South African Party government in their control of Parliament from 1910 to 1924. Botha dies in 1919. Smuts takes over as the Prime Minister, but really their policies continue, across the reigns of these two figures. Smuts and Botha were all about trying to bring together the entire white, to create a coalition of all white people in South Africa. So to do that, they, passed legislation, or they had rhetoric that was perceived by Afrikaners as pro-British. And this is one of the things that drove a wedge, into their party, right? Their policy of appeasement of the British, and their eventual absorption of a British-dominated political party called the Unionist Party, one that had emerged in Natal during the period after the South African War, really was, kind of a party in control of mostly British industrialists and British mine owners, but never played a huge role in national politics. This appeasement by the South African Party led to the incorporation or the absorption of the Unionist Party in 1921. This cozying up to the British angered a lot of Afrikaners, and JBM Hertzog, James Barry can't remember his other middle name. Anyway, probably shouldn't have said that. Hertzog, who had been a general on the Afrikaner side during the war, as had Smuts and Botha for that matter, but had emerged as a leader in the Orange Free State after the war, or the Orange River Colony as it was called then. He had formed in, I think, 1906, a new party which he called the National Party, right? And this was a party that appealed a great deal to these disaffected Afrikaners, who began to turn against Smuts and against Botha, and to foment for greater sponsorship of the Afrikaners, who still saw themselves as the downtrodden and the ones who were oppressed by the British. A lot of hatred or disaffection with Smuts revealed itself with the outbreak of the First World War. Botha and Smuts recognized that they were a British dominion, that they needed to support the British Empire. They did see this as an opportunity to accomplish one of the political goals of the Afrikaner community, which was to incorporate Southwest Africa into South Africa. Southwest Africa was at the time controlled by Germany, and so when they joined the British, Smuts in particular was put into, he British educated, right, at Cambridge. He was given command of a British force, which included South African conscripts, and sent into action against the Germans in Southwest Africa. They wrested power. There wasn't a huge German army there, but they managed to wrest power of that territory from the Germans. Smuts would then later command troops in East Africa as well, fighting for control of the German territory of Tanganyika, what later became Tanzania. And so Smuts was quite active during the First World War. This angered a lot of Afrikaners, and there were even riots against the South African government for the choice to side with the British. The government cracked down and killed some of the protesters. After the war, the gold mines were left in a difficult situation. This was a period of high inflation. The price of gold dropped. It tends to do that during periods of kind of global inflation, and or it can if the right factors are there, and it was in this case. Okay. There were a number of factors in why the price of gold dropped, but these two things led to a lot of consternation. And the mine workers began to complain. And one of the things they complained about was, I should say the mine owners began to complain that their profit margins were not very good. And one of the ways that they identified that they could cut some costs and become more productive and make more money was to eliminate some of the positions that were given to white workers. At the time, the average white worker was making 15 times that of a black African worker in the mines. And so these mine owners, who were represented by this organization called the Chamber of Mines, decided that they were going to, tip the company's balance sheet into a more positive direction by taking some of these jobs and giving them to the black workers who would make a much lower wage, right? Well, this led to strikes by the white workers. These turned violent, and both the Chamber of Mines and the white workers appealed to the government. And this was also, by the way, during the time when, interestingly and ironic given what later happened, but this was right after the Russian Revolution. There were workers' movements all over the world, and of course one of the slogans of the Communist Party was "Workers of the World Unite." Well, this became, interestingly, an adopted slogan of these striking mine workers. That is ironic because later on, the National Party government under apartheid is going to use communism as a specter to try to, essentially to attach the label of communism to any, especially black protester against the government's policies. But in this case, that slogan worked for them. Smuts and his government, by this point, Botha was dead. Smuts and his government came down on the side of the Chamber of Mines, and Smuts declared martial law. The army was brought in. They used things like artillery and military aircraft and tanks and things like this to try to break the strikes. Something like 150 people died in this, and several hundred more were injured. Some people were arrested. Some of the leaders of the strikes were arrested and executed by the government. And this really ugly incident is the thing that proved to be the undoing of both Smuts individually and the South African Party more generally. Now, Smuts is not going to go away. We'll see he's still going to be a factor in the South African government. He will come back later and continue to have an impact. So, JBM Hertzog, pictured here in the slide, won election in 1924 with his National Party. And Hertzog, coming from the Orange Free State, representing agricultural Afrikaners, began to enact policies that were much more friendly to the Afrikaners than Smuts ever had. Foremost among these was a great deal of assistance, subsidies to Afrikaner farmers, It was the Hertzog government that extended the franchise, the voting rights to women in South Africa. This is not to say they were progressive politically. They did this out of a simple calculation, right? That if they extended the franchise, the Afrikaners were much more likely, given that South Africa was still, even decades on after the discovery of gold, still a place where especially British settlers went to try to make their fortune. They didn't necessarily take their families with them, or many of these men weren't married. The Afrikaners, on the other hand, were, primarily, at least their identity was as these rural farmers. They, had large families. They were married, and so there were, just demographically, there were more Afrikaner women than there were British women. Moreover, in the Cape, the blacks still had the franchise, and the female suffrage was not extended there to black African women. Black African men still could vote in the Cape elections, but black African women were, by the law, strictly prohibited from doing this. How they justified that, I don't know. We're going to see they justified a lot of things that seem to be absolutely unconscionable, not only to modern people, but even to people in this period. By the 1920s, Afrikaans had emerged as a real force in the cultural identity, the cultural makeup of the Afrikaners. Up until the end of the 19th century, the Dutch Reformed Church continued to use the Bible translation in High Dutch. But by this point, the Bible had been translated into Afrikaans. There was now a robust literature in Afrikaans, novels and poetry. There were songs in Afrikaans. And so Hertzog, knowing the importance of Afrikaans to the Afrikaners, simply changed the constitution to make Afrikaans one of the official languages of the country rather than Dutch. Dutch was eliminated. Nobody's really speaking Dutch at this point, right? These cultural battles, by the way, are not meaningless. Okay, these are really, really important to the Afrikaners. And following, this is not unique to South Africa, but it certainly was welcomed by the Afrikaners. Following the example of Canada and Australia and others, New Zealand, I guess, South Africa began to act in ways that were increasingly independent from Britain, despite still being technically part of the British Empire. They were making their own treaties. They were, sending out their own ambassadors to other places. They were, acting in a number of ways without consulting British Parliament. The Great Depression damaged, to some extent, though, the reputation and prospects of the Hertzog government. They acted in response to the Depression in very conservative ways. The South African currency was one, their monetary policy, rather than let the South African pound, as it was called at this point, the rand wasn't around yet, float against other currencies like the British did with the pound, the South and the Australians did, and others. South Africans maintained a very strong currency. Well, that sounds all well and good, but when you're trying to export things like gold and manufactured products and other natural resources to other places, if they have to pay your inflated the values in a currency that runs strong, this is not good for exports. And so this damaged the economy really severely. Hertzog was convinced that they needed to maintain specifically the South African pound against a gold standard. This was not the trend sort of globally at this point. The argument of the gold standard had really run its course in the United States and other places by this point. But Hertzog, would doggedly continue to adhere to that. So South African economy really took a hit during the Great Depression. And this drove Hertzog back into, with his waning popularity, drove Hertzog back into the arms of Smuts and the South African Party. They joined together to create what was called the United Party. Smuts became the deputy prime minister to Hertzog, and with him came back many of these pro-British policies. And so Hertzog, was seen by many Afrikaners as tainted. This allowed one of the key figures in 20th century South Africa to emerge. D.F. Malan, Daniel F. Malan, who was a minister in the Dutch Reformed Church. He had been an editor of a newspaper. He was a well-known figure among the Afrikaners. Founded a political party which he called the Purified National Party. Now, the National Party had joined with the South African Party to create the United Party. They had took the name National Party, but called it the Purified, and that word is not a throwaway, right? In their minds, this thing had become tainted, had become corrupted, and it needed to be purified with a pure commitment to Afrikaner culture, to Afrikaner identity. Malan and others formed in the 1930s an organization called the Afrikaner Broederbond. And this is a curious organization. It was not a public thing. This is not a political party. It was really more of a secret society made up of the most prominent members of the Afrikaans community, politicians, business owners, people who worked in newspapers, Dutch Reformed clergy, and so forth and so on, right? They did a number of things. They, of course, pressed for political change, supported wholeheartedly Malan and the Purified National Party, but they also created, among other things, a youth organization, which they called, I think, the Voortrekkers or something like that. So going back to the old, the Great Trek and that heritage. This was sort of like the Boy Scouts, or sort of like the Hitler Youth. Okay, it was a training ground or training organization for young Afrikaners to teach them their heritage, to teach them their commitment to South Africa, to imbue in them the notion that they were superior to the Africans and the British were their enemy, and all of this. Maybe the most important and effectual thing that the Afrikaner Broederbond pulled off in the 1930s was the taking over of the celebration of the centenary, the 100-year anniversary of the Great Trek, which was 1938. They reenacted this, for one. They did it in ways that were ahistorical. They started this trek in Cape Town rather than the Eastern Cape, where most of the Voortrekkers had left from. But whole Afrikaner families went and got out their covered wagons and made the trek all the way up to the Transvaal. They actually converged at Blood River, where they had fought the Zulus. They went through all of that. And this may sound like something that is sort of trite and nice for the Afrikaners and everything, but this celebration really, maybe more than any single event in this period, created solidarity among the Afrikaners, and it was the Afrikaner Broederbond who had organized this, right? And so this also led to the formation of another organization, which was known as the Oseva Brandwag. That's translated as the Oxwagon Sentinel, Oxwagon after the Great Trek, of course. This was more of a paramilitary organization modeled after the SA, which was created by the Nazis. And many Afrikaners came to admire Hitler and the Nazis, and to call for the Afrikaners to sort of pattern themselves or to follow in the footsteps of Hitler and the fascists. So that's all going on in the 1930s. South Africa is being affected tremendously by these events sort of globally, right? The Hertzog government enacted a lot of legislation, foremost among these, and I'll talk about some of the other legislation of the segregation era later on, right? We haven't really gotten into that, but one of the things that they enacted that I'll mention here is the Natives Representation Act. This removed the direct franchise from the black community in the Cape and dealt a death blow to, this is really the last vestige of the British designed political system that still existed in the Cape. They created instead an organization called the Natives Representative Council, which was to have an advisory function, and then they allowed the blacks to elect some white representatives, I think 4 at this point, who would represent their interests in Parliament. It should be said that none of the white members of Parliament who were elected by the blacks had really any very close ties to any black African political organizations or anything like this, right? They were aloof from black concerns for the most part. So this is just a further weakening of any access that blacks have to any political recourse here, right? The United Party split in 1939 with the outbreak of World War II. And this is something that I'll talk about in a later lecture. But suffice it to say that the more hardline Afrikaners wanted to support the Nazis in the war, wanted to break completely with the British Empire at this point. Hertzog wanted to remain neutral. Milan called for an alliance with Germany. And Smuts called for South Africa to keep their commitment to the British. And, you know, this came to a vote in Parliament, and the Smuts camp won the vote, and Britain went to war on the side of Britain. Many South African men fought in the war, including many Afrikaners, it should be said, and some black Africans went to war in Europe. And so we'll talk more about the effects of World War II later on, but this led to a full split. Hertzog broke with Smuts, joined with Milan, and you know, this set the stage for the kind of the last chapter of Smuts's long and storied political career, but also the re-emergence in the National Party, or rather the emergence of the now purified National Party under the leadership of Milan, who came to power by 1948. Thanks.